Right now, if a wildfire evacuation alert hit your phone, you do exactly what it tells you to. Grab the essentials, get in the car, get away from the smoke as fast as you can. For most of human history, when the land started looking like that, entire communities did the opposite. They walked toward it with a torch in hand and lit more of it. On purpose. And right now, standing in a forest in California, there's a tree older than the Roman Empire that is, biologically, incapable of having children unless it has been on fire. This isn't one group's trick, and it isn't an accident. From the deserts of Western Australia, to the oak groves of Northern California, to the drowned black soil of the Amazon, people separated by oceans and tens of thousands of years landed on the same discovery. A forest left completely alone doesn't stay healthy. It quietly loads itself with fuel until something, lightning, a spark, bad luck, burns all of it at once. Their fix, invented independently again and again, was to burn it themselves a little at a time before nature did it for them the hard way. Here's how 3 continents landed on the same secret, using completely different fire, and what happened more than once when someone decided to take the matches away. Somewhere around 50,000 years ago, the first humans reached a continent that had never felt a human hand, and it already knew how to burn. Lightning had been igniting Australia's interior for millions of years before anyone arrived. What changed wasn't fire showing up, it was fire getting rules. In 2024, a research team led by geochemist Bliege Bird drilled a sediment core out of a sinkhole in northern Australia, a column of mud that had been quietly logging the region's fire history for 150,000 years, layer by layer, like tree rings made of ash. Somewhere around 11,000 years ago, the pattern in that mud shifts. Fires get smaller, more frequent, more evenly spread across the seasons, instead of clustering around the hottest, driest months the way lightning fires do. That's not what an unmanaged fire regime looks like. That's what a schedule looks like. It took until 1969 for outside science to catch up with what was already obvious to the people doing it. Archaeologist Rhys Jones, watching Aboriginal land use in Tasmania, coined a term for it: fire stick farming, using flame the way a European farmer would use a plow to decide what grows where. Some researchers connect this early burning to something darker, as Australia's slow-breeding giant animals, like the 2.5-ton wombat relative Diprotodon, disappeared within a few thousand years of humans arriving. A number of archaeologists argue fire hunting played a direct role in wiping them out. Others strongly disagree, and that particular argument is still unresolved in the academic literature. Verify. The precise weight and extinction timeline attributed to Diprotodon varies somewhat between sources. Treat as approximate. What isn't disputed is the endpoint. By the time Europeans reached Australia in 1788, they weren't looking at wilderness. They were looking at 50,000 years of landscaping. 800 people spread across 8 dialect groups in a stretch of Western Australian desert bigger than the United Kingdom. That's the Martu, and for the women among them, the single most important animal on the menu is a burrowing lizard the length of a human leg. It's the sand goanna, a species of monitor lizard, and it can supply close to 40% of the calories a Martu family forages in a season. Finding one buried under a wall of Spinifex grass is nearly impossible. Finding one in ground that was burned 3 weeks earlier is a different problem entirely. The grass is gone. The burrow mouth is exposed. The tracks sit right there in the ash. So that's the method. Light a small fire, somewhere around 55 acres. Hunt the cleared ground for goanna. Then move on and let the patch start growing back. For a decade starting in the early 2000s, Stanford anthropologists Rebecca and Douglas Bird tracked what this actually does to the desert, and the result caught a lot of ecologists off guard. The standard assumption is that hunting thins out prey, not the reverse. In country where Martu burn and hunt regularly, goanna populations run nearly double what they are in unburned country. The reason is scale. A single lightning strike out here can torch 2,000 acres in one uncontrolled run, leaving a landscape that's either all burned or all untouched. Dozens of small, deliberate 55-acre fires do something a lightning strike physically can't. They stitch the desert into a patchwork. Ground burned last week, ground burned last year, ground left alone for 5. And that patchwork of different ages is what actually supports more species, not fewer. It isn't a side effect of hunting. It isn't an accident. The fire is the tool, as deliberately shaped as a fishing net or a plow, and researchers were only catching up to a logic the Martu had already been running for longer than anyone could date. Then, before those researchers ever arrived, someone took the matches away. In the 1960s, the Australian government wanted the Western Desert for something else, a British and Australian rocket and missile testing program. Martu families were moved off traditional country and into settlements, hundreds of miles from land their fires had been shaping for generations. The burning didn't slow down. It stopped, not gradually, but across a landscape the size of a small country, almost all at once. Nothing collapsed overnight. Deserts don't work that way. But across the following decades, as unburned spine effects piled up year after year with nothing to check it, researchers started noticing something specific. Small native mammals the burning had supported for generations, bilbies, several species of native rodent, began disappearing, but only from the areas where the fires had stopped, not from the areas still being burned. By the time some Martu families returned to parts of their country starting in the 1980s, the ecologists working alongside them had a description for what they found, more clinical than poetic: a landscape gone sick. Fuel loads that would once have burned in dozens of small, contained patches were now capable of a single fire tearing through hundreds of square miles in one run, closer to an unmanaged lightning fire regime than anything a Martu hunting party would ever like. The strange part is what it took to prove this wasn't nostalgia. It took satellite imagery, decades of tracked animal populations, and a peer-reviewed paper in a major science journal to formally arrive at a conclusion the people doing the burning had never once doubted. Take the fire away, and a desert left untouched doesn't return to some pure, natural state. It quietly starves. To feed one person for a year in the old villages along the Klamath River, families needed something like 1,000 pounds of acorns. That's not a rounding error number. For oak and tan oak-dependent communities, it's most of a person's calories for 12 months. And acorns have a built-in problem. Left alone on the ground, they get hollowed out from the inside by insect larvae before anyone can harvest them. The Karuk and Yurok solution was fire, timed with a precision that doesn't match the usual image of hunter-gatherer economies. Run a low, slow-ground fire through an oak or tan oak grove in the fall, at the right window in the season, and it kills the filbert worm and filbert weevil larvae burrowed in the leaf litter before they can infest next year's crop, without scorching the canopy or damaging the trees themselves. Get the timing wrong, and modern studies on this exact system have found the opposite result. Burning outside that window does less to control the pests, and can even favor the insects competing with people for the same acorns. This wasn't a lucky habit repeated by accident. It functioned closer to integrated pest management, run with fire instead of chemical spray, tuned to the acorn's own yearly cycle. And the same low fires cleared travel trails, encouraged the hazel shoots used for basket weaving, and kept undergrowth thin enough that a lightning strike in the high country couldn't turn into the kind of fire that reaches a village built of Port Orford cedar planks. Then, starting in the early 1900s, a single policy line from a very young federal agency undid generations of that calibration in one stroke. The rule was called the 10 a.m. policy, and it was almost insultingly simple. Any fire, however it started, however small, had to be put out by 10 the next morning. No exceptions for fires that were supposed to be there. For the Karuk, the Yurok, and dozens of other tribes across the American West, cultural burning didn't just become discouraged. In practical terms, it became illegal. A fire lit on purpose was treated exactly like a fire lit by accident. Put it out immediately, regardless of what it was meant to do. Bill Tripp, who today directs natural resources for the Karuk tribe, has described watching a forest go a full century without the fire it needed. Denser every year, more crowded with fuel. Waiting, the forest didn't wait quietly. A century of accumulated fuel is a large part of why some of California's most destructive wildfire seasons on record, including a run of the largest fires the state has ever documented, clustered in the 2020s, burned as hot and as fast as they did. Fire that should have moved through in small, low pieces every few years instead arrived all at once, after 100 years of buildup, with nothing left to slow it down. It took until this decade for the law to catch back up with the practice. In 2024, California passed Senate Bill 310, formally recognizing tribal authority to carry out cultural burns, a reversal more than 100 years in the making, arriving only after the state had already lived through several of the exact fires that policy was supposed to prevent. 5 miles of stacked rock, arranged in a slow funnel across open prairie, built by hand, pile by pile, leading toward a cliff edge. That's a bison driveline, and some of the best preserved examples anywhere sit on land belonging to the Blackfeet Nation in Montana. Moving an entire herd of half-ton animals 5 miles in a specific direction on command isn't something you do by shouting and waving. Archaeologists studying the Blackfeet drivelines found the missing piece buried in the soil nearby. Bands of charcoal laid down in spring or fall, not summer, which is when lightning fires in this region actually occur. Whoever was lighting these fires was deliberately choosing the off-season. The mechanism, once you see it, is almost embarrassingly simple. Burn a strip of old, dry grass, and within weeks it grows back thinner, greener, and more nutritious than anything around it. Bison, whose entire seasonal movement is built around chasing the best forage, walk toward new growth on their own. Hunters didn't need to force a herd toward the cliff. They just needed to make sure the greenest grass on the northern plains happened to be waiting exactly where the drive line began. It's an unusual kind of hunting technology, a trap built out of grass, with bait set weeks in advance, in a different season, by someone who wouldn't even be there to watch the herd walk into it. Multiply that single trick across the roughly 10,000 years bison and people shared this landscape, and you get a description researchers now use without much hesitation. Not passive foragers reacting to an empty prairie, but engineers of one. Most of the Amazon rainforest is standing on some of the worst farmland on Earth. Thin, acidic, nutrient-starved tropical soil that loses its fertility within a couple of growing seasons if it's cleared and planted. And yet scattered through the basin, in patches sometimes as large as 350 hectares, sit pockets of soil so dark and so rich that Brazilian farmers actively seek them out today. They call it Terra Preta, black earth. Compared to the ground around it, Terra Preta holds roughly 3 times the organic matter, nitrogen, and phosphorus, and around 70 times the charcoal. That charcoal is the clue. Unlike ash, which washes out and depletes within a few seasons, charcoal is chemically stubborn. It locks carbon and nutrients into a porous structure that can hold them in place for centuries, effectively building a slow-release fertilizer directly into the ground. For years, the standard explanation was almost mundane. Generations of people living in the same riverside settlements, cooking over the same fires, slowly built up a midden of ash, bone, pottery, and food waste that transformed the soil beneath their feet, partly by accident. More recent research complicates that picture. Some scientists studying these dark earth sites now argue the chemistry doesn't fully square with accidental buildup alone, and that at least part of it points to the deliberate, repeated charring of biomass, something close to early biochar production, used on purpose as a soil technology rather than left behind as trash. Archaeologists are still arguing over exactly how much of Terra Preta was engineered versus how much simply accumulated from centuries of village life. And the argument matters, because current estimates suggest only a small fraction of the Amazon basin, somewhere near 3%, was ever chemically suited to form Terra Preta at all. Whatever mix of habit and intention built it, it turned some of the least farmable ground on the planet into land that's still unusually productive, 500 years after the people who built it were gone. Here's the single strangest fact in this entire story. A giant sequoia cannot reproduce without fire. Not struggles without it. Cannot, biologically at all. A mature sequoia's crown carries hundreds of small green cones, and each one can sit there, fully formed, holding viable seeds, for up to 20 years without opening. The cone is essentially waiting, sealed with resin that only cracks under heat, specifically the kind of heat a low, fast-moving ground fire produces. No heat, no smoke drying it from the outside in, and the seeds inside simply stay locked away. Eventually the cone falls to the forest floor, seeds still sealed inside, never given a chance. For thousands of years, that was never actually a problem, because fire kept reliably showing up. Indigenous peoples across the Sierra Nevada, including the Tule River tribe, who call the tree Tuspung-ish, burn these groves on a rolling cycle, roughly every 8 to 15 years, clearing the brush and duff that would otherwise smother a fallen seed before it reached bare soil. Between those cultural burns and the occasional lightning strike, a sequoia grove essentially never went more than a decade or two without the exact conditions its own reproductive cycle depends on. Then, starting in the early 1900s, tribal stewardship of these groves was forced out, fire suppression became federal policy, and a cycle that had run for roughly 3,000 years, the age of the oldest living sequoias, simply stopped. For most of a century, almost nothing burned. Fuel piled up on forest floors that had never been allowed to hold that much of it. In 2020 and 2021, 3 wildfires, the Castle Fire, the KMP Complex Fire, and the Windy Fire, tore through Sierra Nevada sequoia groves with an intensity those trees had essentially never evolved to survive. Combined, federal estimates put the toll at up to 14,000 large sequoias killed in 2 fire seasons, as much as 19% of the entire world's population of large giant sequoias. Trees that had stood since before the Roman Empire existed, that needed fire to reproduce, were killed by fire, because the fire that finally arrived, after 100 years of waiting, was nothing like the fire they were built for. So the next time a wildfire alert lights up your phone, telling you to run, it's worth knowing what the actual emergency is. It was never fire touching a forest. For most of the time humans have lived on this planet, fire touching a forest was the plan. The emergency is fire arriving somewhere that hasn't felt it in 100 years, all at once, with a century of fuel and nothing left to slow it down. Every ecosystem in this video didn't go wrong the moment people started lighting fires in it. It went wrong the moment people stopped. That's most of what Barely Human is about. Really, how much of what looks like destruction, looked at closely enough, turns out to be maintenance? If you want more stories like this one, the subscribe button's right there.
Goodbye! See you later!